My name is Sarah Thompson, and I was 32. The morning. I stood in the shadows of a Michigan church balcony, watching my parents weep over my empty casket. They had spent a month telling everyone I died in a tragic accident overseas, shedding perfect tears for the local news. They did it to steal a 7-figure trust fund my grandmother left exclusively to me. As they stood at the altar, accepting condolences and cashing in my life insurance, the heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open. The look on my mother's face when I walk down the center aisle, wearing a black catering uniform, is something I will keep for the rest of my life. Welcome back to Revenge Order, where ordinary people stop setting themselves on fire to keep their toxic families warm, and quietly let the truth do the talking. If a story about slow, calculated justice finds you tonight, you are exactly where you need to be. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from, and subscribe so the next one reaches you too. To understand the funeral, you have to understand the day I officially became a ghost. It started 30 days earlier at a border control booth in Lisbon, Portugal. I work as a remote cybersecurity auditor. My job requires me to hunt digital anomalies for private clients, which means I frequently drop off the grid. I had just surfaced from a 6-week contract auditing a server farm. 6 weeks of no personal emails, no social media, no calls to my family back in Michigan. I assumed they hardly noticed. My parents, Diane and Richard, only ever called me when they needed a loan co-signed or a laptop fixed. Their real attention always belonged to my older brother Bradley. I approached the departure booth, running on 3 hours of sleep, and handed my Navy passport to the Portuguese border agent. I expected a quick stamp. Instead, his fingers went rigid over his keyboard. He stared at his monitor, his brow pulling together. He did not hand the booklet back. He picked up a landline phone, dialed a short extension, and spoke rapidly in Portuguese. Within seconds, 2 armed officers in dark uniforms stepped out from behind a concrete pillar and flanked my shoulders. "Man," the agent said, his English clipped and precise. "Take 1 step back from the counter." I kept my breathing steady. Panic is a vulnerability in my line of work. I asked if there was an issue with my visa. He slid my passport into a clear plastic sleeve and sealed the top. "The issue is that the United States State Department flagged this document 3 days ago," he said softly. "The owner of this passport is legally deceased." They escorted me to a windowless holding room that smelled of industrial bleach and stale coffee. They let me keep my phone, assuming it was a useless piece of hardware without a cellular signal. They did not know I had an encrypted partition that bypassed local network restrictions. Sitting on a cold metal bench, I opened my banking app, expecting to see a routine security freeze. The screen loaded. My primary checking account displayed a red padlock icon underneath the padlock. Plain black text delivered the verdict. Account status closed. Account holder deceased. My thumb hovered over the glass. A distinct chill threaded its way through my chest. I opened a secure browser and navigated to the private financial portal, holding my grandmother's trust. This trust was the raw nerve of my family dynamic. When my grandmother passed away, she bypassed my parents and Bradley entirely, leaving her $12 million estate in a locked trust. For me, my family smiled at the reading of the will, calling it a blessing. But the resentment radiated off them. Now sitting in a Portuguese detention room, I watched the portal load. The balance read 0. Beneath the empty column, a single line of administrative text explained the void. Funds disbursed to next of kin upon receipt of certified death certificate. Estate closed. The air in the room felt suddenly thin. This was not a random identity theft, perpetrated by a stranger in a basement. It was an inside job. My parents had weaponized my 6 weeks of silence. They had legally buried me, convinced a Michigan judge to issue a death certificate, and liquidated my future. They assumed my disappearance was a stroke of luck. They could monetize, leaving me stranded notion away without a dime. They just forgot one thing about stealing a ghost's life savings. You better make certain she does not know how to navigate the dark. Being declared dead while you are still breathing is a logistical nightmare designed to break your spirit. The Portuguese border guards held me in that windowless room for 3 hours, waiting for a representative from the American consulate to wake up and answer their phone. I knew exactly how that phone call would go. Surrendering a dead passport to the United States government triggers an automatic bureaucratic lockdown. They would confiscate my identification, restrict my travel, and place me in an administrative purgatory that could take 6 months to untangle. I would be stuck in a cheap Lisbon hotel, filling out forms and waiting for fingerprint verifications, while my family spent my inheritance. I did not have 6 months. I had days when the senior border agent returned to the holding room, holding a stack of printed paperwork. I made my move. I reached into the hidden lining of my laptop bag, unzipped a concealed pocket, and pulled out a dark red booklet. My secondary passport. I hold dual Irish citizenship through my maternal grandfather, a corporate failsafe I established years ago to navigate international firewalls. For my European clients, I slid the red passport across the metal table. I told the agent I was willing to surrender the flagged American document for their internal investigation, provided I was free to enter the European Union as an Irish citizen. He scrutinized the gold harp on the cover, scanned the biometric chip and nodded. The system verified it. I walked out of the airport into the damp Lisbon morning, a living woman on paper, but a ghost in the eyes of my family. I needed to see the architecture of their theft. I bypassed the tourist districts and found a small electronics repair shop on a quiet side street. I paid cash for a refurbished laptop, walked to a neighborhood cafe and ordered an espresso. I connected to a public network, routed my IP address through a secure server in Reykjavik, and went to work. If you want to understand how someone betrays you, follow the money. I hacked back into my grandmother's estate portal, using a backdoor script I had embedded in the financial software. A year earlier, my grandmother had trusted me to audit the estate, cyber security, before she passed. Knowing my parents had a habit of snooping where they did not belong, she was a shrewd woman. She knew my father viewed her wealth as his delayed right and my mother treated money like a weapon. The portal dashboard loaded on the cheap laptop screen. I pulled the transaction logs. 3 days ago, my parents submitted a certified death certificate to the trust executives. The executors, following standard legal protocol for a deceased beneficiary, released the $12 million to my next of kin. The money had moved. I ran a trace on the routing numbers. My parents, Diane and Richard, had parked the funds in a temporary holding account at a Midwestern regional bank. I stared at the banking structure on the screen, recognizing the maneuver instantly. It was a staging ground. In the world of forensic accounting, you do not keep stolen funds in a domestic account, where the IRS or a suspicious underwriter can freeze them. You move them. I pulled up the scheduled transfers, pending on their account. There it was. A programmed automated clearinghouse transfer. In exactly 10 days the entire $12 million would automatically route to an offshore shell company, registered in the Cayman Islands. Once the money crossed that digital border, it would vanish into a maze of corporate privacy laws, making it legally untouchable. The regional bank required a 10-day cooling-off period. 4 trust disbursements of that size to clear preliminary fraud checks. My parents were sitting in Michigan right now, watching the clock tick down, waiting for the money to cross the finish line. I took a sip of my espresso. It was bitter and cold. I closed my eyes and pictured my parents in their pristine, suburban kitchen. I was the capable, quiet daughter, the one they called when the wireless router broke, when the tax software crashed, when my father needed someone with pristine credit to co-sign a loan for a new vehicle. I fixed their problems efficiently and without complaint. They mistook my utility for subservience. They mistook my quiet nature for weakness. Their true devotion was entirely reserved for my older brother Bradley. Bradley was the charismatic real estate agent, the coddled golden child, who possessed a spectacular talent for spending capital he had not earned. I spent my 20s watching my parents bail him out of failed business ventures and quiet legal scrapes. If Bradley wrecked a car, they bought him a nicer one to soothe his bruised confidence. If I earned a promotion, they asked if I could chip in for Bradley's new apartment deposit. They viewed my stability as a resource to be mined for his benefit. They assumed I would stay in Europe. They assumed that even if I realized my accounts were frozen, I would be paralyzed by the red tape, crying in a consulate lobby, waiting for a government clerk to fix my life. They planned this, assuming I would play the role I always played, the victim who absorbs the damage, so the family can keep smiling. They were wrong. I shut the laptop. I was not going to wait for a judge to declare me alive. I was going to follow the money, and I was going to cut the strings before the transfer executed. I could not fly direct to Detroit. My name and biometric profile were flagged on every inbound flight to the United States. If I tried to cross a U.S. customs checkpoint, the system would alert Homeland Security that a dead woman was trying to clear passport control, and the ensuing investigation would give my parents the 10 days they needed. I opened a fresh browsing tab and navigated to an international airline portal, using my Irish passport and a secure cryptocurrency wallet. I booked a one-way ticket to Toronto, Canada. The flight left in 4 hours. From Toronto I could rent a vehicle with cash and slip across the Ambassador Bridge into Michigan, through a land border crossing using my EU credentials. I packed the laptop into my bag and stood up. The hunt was officially on. But as I walked out of the cafe and hailed a taxi to the airport, a new question began to gnaw at the back of my mind. The timing of my death was too precise. My parents had always been greedy, but orchestrating a fake death certificate required desperation. They were risking federal prison for a payout. They could have waited a few more years to inherit. Naturally. Why did they need $12 million right now? What kind of fire were they trying to put out? Sitting in the back of the taxi, I pulled out my phone and decided to check the one place I usually avoided. I typed my brother Bradley's name into a social media search bar. The page loaded, and the answer to my question stared back at me. Far worse than anything I had calculated. I landed at Toronto Pearson International Airport. Just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the Canadian customs agent barely glanced at my Irish passport before stamping it. He welcomed me to Ontario. He did not know he was welcoming a ghost. I rented a mid-size sedan, using cash and a prepaid debit card, merging onto the highway that would take me south toward the United States border. The drive was long and quiet. giving me ample time to process the discovery I made. In the back of the Lisbon taxi, the social media search had revealed my brother Bradley's public profile, which was uncharacteristically somber. The pinned post at the top of his feed was a black and white photograph of me, taken at a family barbecue 3 years ago. The caption read, "In loving memory of my beautiful sister Sarah, lost to us too soon in a tragic hiking accident abroad. Our hearts are broken." The post had 3,000 likes. People from my high school neighbors I grew up with, and members of my parents' community church, had flooded the comments with condolences. They were mourning a fiction. But the real gut punch was not the fake grief. It was the hyperlink anchored at the bottom of the post. Bradley had created a crowdfunding page titled, "The Sarah Thompson Repatriation and Memorial Fund." The stated goal was $50,000. The description claimed, the family was facing insurmountable international legal fees and transport costs to bring my body home for a proper burial. The progress bar showed they had already collected $42,000 from well-meaning friends and relatives. My parents were not merely stealing my grandmother's trust, they were monetizing the sympathy of our entire community. They were using my manufactured death as a lucrative public relations campaign. The sheer audacity of the grift made my grip tighten on the steering wheel. I was not just dealing with greedy relatives anymore. I was dealing with calculating predators who viewed my existence as a tradable commodity. I reached the Ambassador Bridge crossing into Detroit. Near midnight, the glaring fluorescent lights of the customs booth illuminated the interior of the rental car. I handed my Irish passport to the American Border Patrol officer. He swiped the document, asked the purpose of my visit, and inquired how long I intended to stay in Michigan. I told him I was visiting colleagues for a few weeks to conduct a corporate audit. He handed the passport back and raised the barrier, stepping out of the vehicle at a desolate gas station on the Michigan side of the border. Felt deeply surreal. The air smelled like exhaust and damp asphalt. I was standing in my own hometown, a place I had navigated for 32 years. Yet I had never felt more invisible. I was a dead woman walking through familiar streets. Every police cruiser that drove past, every security camera mounted outside a convenience store, felt like a potential threat. If my biometric profile was scanned, the system would alert the authorities that a deceased citizen was roaming the suburbs, and my parents would have the warning they needed to accelerate their offshore transfer. I walked into the gas station and purchased a cheap, prepaid burner phone and a handful of network cards. With the last of my physical cash, I drove to a nondescript roadside motel on the outskirts of the county, paying the night clerk up front under the alias Clara Vance. The room smelled of old smoke and cheap carpet cleaner. I locked the deadbolt, pulled the heavy curtains shut, and sat on the edge of the sagging mattress. My instinct urged me to call the local police precinct and report the fraud immediately, but logic overruled emotion. If I walked into a police station with a wild story about a faked death and a stolen trust fund, the bureaucratic gears would grind at a glacial pace. Detectives would need to verify my identity, contact the Portuguese authorities, and open a formal investigation. During that lengthy process, my parents would undoubtedly catch wind of the inquiry. They would claim they were the innocent victims of a sophisticated, international scam, feigning shock and horror that someone had tricked them into believing their daughter was dead. They would hire expensive defense attorneys with my stolen money and drag the legal battle out for years. I did not want a prolonged legal battle. I wanted total undeniable destruction. To achieve that, I needed an ally who understood the architecture of my grandmother's wealth better than anyone else. I needed the man who drafted the trust. At 6:00 in the morning, I parked the rental car 3 blocks away from a prestigious law firm in downtown Detroit. I walked the remaining distance, my collar pulled up against the biting morning wind. I waited in the cold shadow of the building until I saw a familiar silver sedan pull into the private parking garage. Marcus Thorne was my grandmother's estate attorney. He was a ruthless, fiercely loyal old-school lawyer who operated with surgical precision. He had spent decades protecting my grandmother's assets from my parents' transparent attempts to borrow against her portfolio. He respected competence and despised entitlement. I bypassed the main lobby and took the service elevator to his floor, timing my arrival just before the receptionist was scheduled to unlock the front doors. I stood in the quiet hallway as Marcus stepped out of the executive elevator, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand and a heavy leather briefcase in the other. He turned the corner, his eyes focused on the floor tiles. When he looked up and saw me standing by his office door, he stopped walking. His fingers went slack. The leather briefcase hit the carpet with a dull thud. "Sarah," he whispered, the color draining from his face. His voice lacked its usual authoritative boom. I did not offer a tearful reunion. I did not move to hug him. I simply picked up his briefcase, handed it back to him, and gestured toward his office door. "Let us go inside, Marcus," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "We have a ledger to balance." He unlocked the door with trembling hands. Once we were inside his private suite, he locked the heavy mahogany door behind us and closed the blinds. He stared at me from across his massive desk, struggling to reconcile the living woman in front of him with the certified legal documents currently sitting in his filing cabinet. I sat in the leather guest chair and slid my refurbished laptop across his pristine desk. I opened the screen to the digital trail I had uncovered. "In Lisbon, my parents forged a death certificate," I said, tapping the screen. "They convinced the executors to release the $12 million trust." I traced the routing numbers. They parked the capital in a regional holding account. They are 10 days away from executing an automated transfer to an offshore shell company in the Cayman Islands. Marcus leaned forward, his sharp legal mind instantly replacing his initial shock. He studied the transaction logs, his eyes scanning the data with practiced efficiency. He reached into his bottom drawer, pulled out a thick manila folder labeled Thompson Estate, and flipped past the standard disbursement schedules. They submitted authenticated medical records from a hospital in Portugal. Marcus said, his voice hardening into a low growl. "They claimed you succumbed to injuries from a severe hiking fall. They provided a consular report of death abroad. The documentation was flawless, Sarah. It passed 3 separate fraud checks. They paid a professional," I replied. "They are running a crowdfunding scam on social media to cover their tracks. But I need to know our leverage. If we freeze the account right now, they will claim they were duped. They will play the grieving victims. I need a way to lock them into the fraud permanently." Marcus flipped to the very back of the estate file. He tapped his pen against a specific, highlighted paragraph on the final page of the trust agreement. A tight, dangerous smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Your grandmother knew exactly who she raised, Sarah," Marcus said quietly. "She did not trust your parents any more than you do. She forced me to draft a highly unusual stipulation before she died. She called it the fail-safe." He turned the document so I could read the highlighted text. "It is a strict morality clause," Marcus explained, his eyes locking onto mine. if any beneficiary or next of kin commits verified fraud against the estate in an attempt to secure an early or unearned disbursement, they do not just forfeit their current claim, they absorb the estate's legal debts and any financial damages incurred during the recovery process. I read the legal jargon twice. The implication was staggering. My parents were not just stealing my money by executing the fraudulent transfer, they were legally signing away their own financial security. The trap was already built, woven into the very fabric of the trust they were currently plundering. I looked up from the document, my mind calculating the next move. We do not stop the transfer today, I said, the plan forming with crystal clarity. We let them think they won. We let them spend the GoFundMe money. We let them schedule the fake funeral. We let them sign the final disbursement papers to initiate the offshore wire. Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his hands together. You want them to step inside the trap and close the door themselves. Exactly, I replied. But as I packed up my laptop, preparing to leave the safety of his office, a new piece of evidence pinged on my burner phone. It was an automated alert I had set up to monitor my parents' cloud storage. A new document had just been uploaded to a shared folder, titled Bradley Legal Defense. I opened the PDF and the true, terrifying scale of their desperation finally snapped into focus. I left Marcus standing in his downtown office and drove back to the desolate roadside motel. The burner phone rested on the passenger seat, its screen glowing with the notification I had triggered before walking into the law firm. It was an automated alert tied to my parents' cloud storage network. A new file had synchronized to a hidden folder labeled Bradley Legal Defense. The air inside the motel room was stale, smelling of cheap detergent and old dust. I sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, the synthetic fabric scratching against my wool coat. I opened the newly uploaded PDF file. It was a formal legal document, stamped by the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Michigan. The plaintiff was the federal government. The defendant was my older brother. I read the charging document line by line, my eyes scanning the dense legal terminology. Bradley was not merely enduring a streak of bad luck in the local real estate market, as my parents loved to claim. At neighborhood dinner parties, he was facing a multi-count federal indictment for orchestrating a sophisticated property escrow scam. According to the prosecutor, Bradley had created a series of dummy shell companies to funnel investor capital into his personal accounts. The total net loss was nearly $1 million. The federal prosecutor offered a strict plea agreement. Bradley could avoid a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary, but only if you provided $800,000 in immediate victim restitution before his sentencing hearing next month. My parents did not possess $800,000 in liquid assets. Their retirement portfolio was heavily leveraged to support their country club lifestyle. They owned a sprawling suburban home, 2 luxury vehicles and significant credit card debt. They lacked the capital to save him when the federal government threatened to lock their favorite child in a concrete cell. For a decade they panicked. The timeline of the indictment aligned perfectly with my disappearance in Europe. They did not forge the Portuguese medical records out of simple, opportunistic greed. It was a desperate, calculated blood sacrifice. When faced with the prospect of their golden boy wearing an orange jumpsuit, they chose to slaughter the invisible workhorse. They traded my legal existence for his freedom, using my stolen inheritance as a legal slush fund to pay off federal prosecutors. Knowing the true motive shifted the parameters of the game. I closed the court docket and pulled up the social media profile. I had briefly viewed in the Lisbon taxi. I needed to see how far the public deception stretched. Bradley had updated his page again that morning. He posted a video montage featuring pictures from my childhood, set to a melancholic piano track. The caption detailed the agonizing process of dealing with foreign embassies and the staggering costs associated with returning my remains to American soil. Below the video sat the link to the Sarah Thompson Repatriation Fund. I clicked the URL. The campaign page loaded, displaying a progress meter that hovered near the $50,000 goal. The current total sat at $42,000. I scrolled through the donor list, the names hitting me with a strange surreal weight. These were not anonymous internet strangers throwing money at a tragic headline. I saw a $500 contribution from my high school calculus teacher, accompanied by a paragraph praising my aptitude for mathematics. I saw donations from the elderly couple who lived next door to us growing up, the ones who used to pay me to mow their lawn. Members of my parents' church congregation left comments, offering prayers alongside their credit card payments. The sheer volume of lies required to accept that money was staggering. My family was scamming their own community, weaponizing the empathy of good people to pad their pockets, while the trust fund processed through the regional holding account. As I analyzed the donor ledger, a notification ponged on Bradley's profile. His fiancée, Jessica, had just started a live video broadcast. I clicked the glowing thumbnail. Jessica filled the screen. Sitting in a kitchen I recognized instantly. The white marble countertops, the stainless steel appliances, the specific angle of the morning light hitting the cabinets. It was my kitchen. My parents had already cleared out my rented apartment and handed the keys to Bradley and his future bride. Jessica smiled into the camera lens, adjusting her blonde hair, holding a pristine white ceramic mug. She thanked her followers for the overwhelming support and prayers during this season of unimaginable grief. Then, with an effortless pivot that would impress a seasoned grifter, she changed the subject to her wedding registry. "We are just so blessed," Jessica cooed to her audience, taking a delicate sip from the mug. "Sarah always wanted us to have the perfect start to our lives together. Thanks to her generous parting gift, Bradley and I are finalizing the deposits for the Aspen venue this afternoon. She would want us to celebrate life." She panned the phone camera across my former living room. My vintage bookshelf was gone, replaced by a sterile modern entertainment center and a white leather sectional. They were spending the charity money on luxury upgrades. They were spending my life to fund their aesthetic. I watched her smile into the digital void. Any lingering trace of familial sorrow I carried across the Atlantic Ocean vanished in that exact instant. The hollow ache of betrayal evaporated. In its place, a cold, calculating calm settled over my mind. I was a professional auditor. You do not mourn a fraudulent ledger. You investigate the discrepancies. You document the theft and you enforce the penalty. To execute the legal trap Marcus and I outlined, digital screenshots of a federal docket would not suffice in a court of law. If my parents challenged the authenticity of the fail-safe clause, we needed undeniable physical proof. I needed the original, notarized copy of my grandmother's trust. The exact document, containing the embedded morality clause, bearing her wet ink signature. That document was not stored in a bank vault or a lawyer's filing cabinet. My grandmother had handed that thick envelope directly to me 5 years ago, instructing me to keep it hidden from my parents. I had sealed it inside a fireproof floor safe, concealed beneath the carpet in my apartment bedroom. The same apartment Bradley and Jessica were currently occupying. I closed the laptop and placed it safely inside my bag. I checked the time on my prepaid phone. It was Tuesday afternoon. Bradley usually spent his Tuesdays playing golf with his defense attorneys, discussing plea strategies on the fairway. Jessica had just mentioned a cake tasting appointment on her live stream, meaning she would be leaving the property soon. The window of opportunity was incredibly narrow. I needed to retrieve that folder before they decided to renovate the bedroom floors and discovered a vault they could not open. I walked out of the motel room and started the rental car engine. Breaking into my own home was a necessary risk. As I drove toward my old neighborhood, navigating the familiar suburban streets, I realized bypassing the physical locks on the front door would be the easy part. The real danger lay in what I might find waiting for me inside the walls of my stolen life. I parked the rental car 3 streets away from my former apartment complex, choosing a spot partially obscured by a line of mature oak trees. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. I sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, checking the GPS tracking beacon I had stealthily tied to Bradley's mobile device. Years ago I installed it, originally under the guise of an anti-theft feature, when I bought him a new phone for his birthday. Another silent favor for the family. Now that favor provided my tactical advantage. The blue dot representing his location glowed steadily on my screen. Resting miles away at a high-end bakery downtown, he and Jessica were currently sampling buttercream frosting for a wedding funded by my demise. The immediate radius around the apartment building was clear. I walked the familiar route to the brick complex, keeping my head down, a dark wool scarf pulled high around my jawline. My heart maintained a steady measured rhythm. I approached the heavy wooden door of Unit 4B. The brass numbers glinted in the sunlight. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the spare key. I kept on a separate ring. The landlord required tenants to surrender all keys upon breaking a lease. But my parents, assuming I was dead in a European morgue, had no reason to search for a hidden spare. I slid the key into the deadbolt. The mechanism turned with a satisfying metallic click. I pushed the door open and stepped over the threshold, closing it quietly behind me. The air inside the apartment hit me first. The familiar scent of my favorite cedarwood incense was entirely gone. It had been replaced by the overwhelming, cloying fragrance of expensive vanilla candles and fresh paint. I stood in the entryway and absorbed the visual erasure of my life. My worn leather reading chair, the antique oak desk I restored myself, the framed travel photographs lining the hallway, all of it had been discarded. The space was now decorated in a sterile, monochromatic grey palette. It looked like a staged model unit in a luxury development, utterly devoid of personality. I moved silently through the living room, my boots making no sound on the hardwood floor. I was a trespasser in a space I had inhabited for 4 years. The profound sense of violation sharpened my focus. Every piece of missing furniture reinforced the necessity of the mission. They had erased me. With terrifying speed, I navigated down the short hallway and entered the primary bedroom. The layout remained identical, but a massive, king-size bed dominated the center of the room, flanked by mirrored nightstands. A thick plush white area rug covered the floor beneath the bed frame. I knew exactly what rested beneath that pristine wool. I knelt beside the mattress and gripped the edge of the heavy rug, rolling it back toward the wall. The underlying hardwood floor panels appeared perfectly uniform. I pressed my palm against the specific plank nearest the corner baseboard and applied firm downward pressure. The false panel popped up, revealing the cold steel face of the concealed floor safe. I had purchased this specific model because it lacked a digital keypad. Digital safes can be bypassed by anyone with basic hacking knowledge. This safe relied on a complex mechanical combination dial. I spun the heavy dial right, left and right again, aligning the precise numerical sequence. The heavy steel locking bolts disengaged. With a dull thud, I lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting beneath a stack of old tax returns, was the thick manila envelope containing my grandmother's original trust documents. The wet ink signatures, the embossed notary seals, the highlighted failsafe clause. The physical proof required to destroy my parents' carefully constructed fiction. I grabbed the thick envelope and shoved it deep into the interior breast pocket of my wool coat. I reached to close the heavy steel lid. Outside the bedroom window, the distinct sound of a car door slamming shut echoed through the quiet suburban street. I froze, my hand hovering over the safe. The heavy tread of dress shoes, hitting the concrete walkway, drifted toward the front entrance of the building. The sound bypassed the neighboring units and stopped directly outside door. 4B. A key scraped against the brass deadbolt lock. My pulse spiked. A sudden surge of adrenaline flooding my system. I checked my burner phone. The GPS tracker dot remained fixed. At the downtown bakery, Bradley must have left his phone on the table. With Jessica, he had returned to the apartment early, and he was walking through the front door. I shoved the false floor panel back into place and frantically kicked the heavy white rug flat, smoothing the fibers with my boot. The front door creaked open, followed by the heavy thud of a briefcase hitting the entryway console table. I spun around, scanning the bedroom for an exit. The window was locked and framed by dense security bars. The only way out was through the hallway, a path currently blocked by my brother. I retreated toward the walk-in closet, located adjacent to the en suite bathroom. I slipped inside the narrow space, pulling the louvered door shut behind me, until only a sliver of light penetrated the darkness. The closet smelled strongly of designer cologne and dry cleaning chemicals. I pressed my back against the rear wall, burying myself behind a row of hanging suit jackets, forcing my breathing into shallow, silent intervals. Heavy footsteps moved down the hallway, drawing closer. Bradley walked into the primary bedroom. I watched him through the narrow gap in the closet slats. He wore an expensive tailored suit, the fabric pulling tight across his shoulders. He looked agitated. He paced across the white rug, entirely unaware that a steel safe, holding his financial ruin, rested inches beneath the soles of his shoes. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a secondary mobile device. He dialed the number, holding the phone to his ear. "You promised the wire transfer would clear by noon." Bradley snapped into the receiver, his voice tight with barely contained panic. "The federal prosecutor is demanding the restitution deposit by Friday. If that money does not hit my escrow account, the plea deal collapses. I am not going to a federal penitentiary because your banking compliance department is slow." I stood perfectly still in the dark, the manila envelope pressing against my ribs. He was yelling at my parents. He was demanding the proceeds of my fake death to save his own life. "Make the bank expedite the offshore routing," Bradley demanded, pacing closer to the closet door. "Tell them whatever you have to tell them. Tell them you need the funds to pay for Sarah's funeral expenses. They love a tragic story. Use it." The callousness of the statement hung in the air. He was instructing our parents to leverage my manufactured funeral to pressure a bank manager. He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the closet. The toes of his leather dress shoes were inches from the louvered wood. If he reached for the brass handle, The silent war would instantly escalate into a physical confrontation. I clenched my fists, bracing my muscles. I calculated the distance between the door frame and the hallway exit. If he opened the door, I would have to push past him, sprint through the apartment and vanish before he could process the fact that a dead woman was standing in his bedroom. The silence stretched thick and suffocating. Bradley sighed, loudly rubbing his temple with his free hand. "Fine," he muttered into the phone. "Call me when the confirmation number hits your inbox. I have to get back to the bakery before Jessica starts asking questions about the budget." He ended the call. Shoving the phone back into his pocket, he turned away from the closet, grabbed a dark cashmere overcoat, draped across the foot of the bed, and walked swiftly out of the bedroom. The front door opened and slammed shut the deadbolt. Engaging from the outside, I remained perfectly motionless in the dark closet for 5 full minutes, waiting until the sound of his car engine faded into the distance. The ghost survived the encounter. I stepped out of the closet, my breathing returning to normal. I possessed the notarized trust documents. We had the leverage required to execute the trap Marcus designed. But Bradley's panicked phone call revealed a crucial detail that altered the timeline. My parents were attempting to expedite the offshore wire transfer by citing immediate funeral expenses. The bank might bypass the 10-day cooling-off period and release the capital tomorrow. I walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind me. I could not wait for the bank to process the paperwork. I needed to block the transfer at the source. And to do that, I had to expose the second layer of their massive financial grift. The trust was only the foundation of their theft. The real payout, the one they were relying on to sustain their future luxury, resided in a completely different corporate vault. It was time to hunt the insurance money. I drove back to the desolate motel, with both hands gripping the steering wheel. The thick manila envelope rested on the passenger seat. The heater in the rental car blasted warm air, but a distinct chill remained. In my bones, I had just stood in a dark closet, while my brother arranged my funeral to secure his own financial salvation. The theoretical betrayal had transformed into a physical reality. I parked outside my room, scanning the empty lot to ensure no vehicles had followed me from the apartment complex. Inside the room, I engaged the deadbolt and the chain lock. I spread the contents of the envelope across the faded floral bedspread. The original trust documents were pristine. The heavy paper bore my grandmother's authentic signature and the raised seal of a licensed notary. I traced my finger over the morality clause Marcus had highlighted. Earlier that morning, we possessed the exact ammunition required to execute the legal trap. But as I gathered the pages to return them to the folder, a secondary document slipped from the back flap and fluttered onto the mattress. It was printed on high-quality corporate bond paper, featuring the embossed logo of a premier global insurance conglomerate. I picked up the stray document. My eyes scanned the bold text at the top of the page. It was a term life insurance policy declaration. The primary insured individual was Sarah Thompson. The designated beneficiaries were Diane and Richard Thompson. The coverage amount was $1 million. I checked the origination date. Printed in the bottom corner, they initiated the policy 3 years ago. I sat on the edge of the bed, the paper shaking slightly in my hand. 3 years ago, my father had asked me to sign a stack of convoluted legal forms. He claimed he was updating his estate planning and needed me to authorize a standard health proxy. I recalled reading the documents carefully, ensuring I was only signing standard medical directives. I never signed an application For $1 million life insurance policy. I looked closer. At the signature line on the declaration page, the ink formed a flawless replica of my handwriting. The loops and angles were meticulously traced. My parents had forged my consent to build a financial parachute based on my mortality. The cold mathematics of their scheme finally aligned in my head. Radley needed $800,000 to satisfy the federal prosecutor and avoid a lengthy prison sentence. My grandmother's trust held $1.2 million. If my parents liquidated the trust to pay the restitution, they would only retain $400,000. After paying the capital gains taxes, the international fixer, and the extravagant Aspen wedding expenses Jessica advertised online, the remaining capital would be insufficient to sustain my parents' country club lifestyle. They refused to downgrade their standard of living. They needed a multiplier. They needed a massive influx of untraceable cash. The trust was merely the down payment. My death was the ultimate payday. I placed the forged policy next to my refurbished laptop. If they intended to collect a 7-figure payout, they had to navigate a severe corporate gauntlet. I booted the computer, routed my connection through the secure European server, and navigated to the insurance conglomerate online claims portal. I needed to see the current status of their fraudulent application. The login screen required an account number and a registered phone verification. I typed the policy number from the printed page. To bypass the two-factor authentication, I ran a spoofing script that intercepted the security code sent to my father's mobile device, routing the text message directly to my screen. The portal dashboard materialized. The claim status glowed in bright red text. Pending corporate investigation. Insurance. Underwriters do not write million-dollar checks simply because a grieving family produces a foreign piece of paper. High-value payouts linked to international fatalities automatically trigger a mandatory, rigorous internal audit. The corporation had frozen the funds. Pending a field inquiry, I opened the digital case notes attached to the file. The conglomerate had assigned the investigation to a senior fraud auditor named Agent Vance. I ran a rapid background query on his credentials. Vance was a former federal investigator, known for dissecting complex financial discrepancies. He was not a desk clerk. He was a professional skeptic. The portal displayed the upcoming itinerary for the claim. Agent Vance had an in-person field interview scheduled for the following morning. At 9 o'clock, the location was my parents' suburban home. He was traveling to Michigan to look them in the eye, assess their grief, and determine the authenticity of their loss. I clicked on the Evidence tab within the portal. My parents had already uploaded several digital files to preemptively support their story. There were scanned copies of the fabricated Portuguese medical records, a copy of the fake death certificate, and several staged family photographs designed to establish my identity and their profound sorrow. I opened the most recent photograph. It was a high-resolution image of my mother, sitting on her pristine living room sofa. She held a framed picture of my college graduation against her chest, gazing mournfully out the window. Her performance was flawless. But as I zoomed in on the high-definition image, my focus shifted from her manufactured tears to the base of her throat. Resting against her collarbone was a distinct, deep blue gemstone set in vintage platinum, the custom sapphire pendant. The air left my lungs. My grandmother commissioned that specific necklace and Antwerp decades ago. She wore it every day of her life. Before she died, she placed the velvet box directly into my hands. She bypassed my mother intentionally, stating the sapphire belonged to a woman who understood its true value. Not someone who only saw its price tag. My mother had coveted that necklace for 30 years. I had locked that pendant inside a velvet case, hidden in the back of my bathroom vanity. My mother had not just entered my apartment to hand the lease over to Bradley. She had looted my personal belongings before my supposed body was even cold. She stole the one heirloom that tied me directly to my grandmother, and she had the staggering audacity to wear it while posing for an insurance fraud investigation. The sapphire pendant was the loaded weapon resting on the table. It was undeniable proof of her vanity and her theft. The image of her wearing my legacy shattered the last remaining barrier of familial hesitation. In my mind, I closed the photograph and shut the laptop screen. Tomorrow morning, Agent Vance would walk up the paved driveway of my childhood home. He would ring the doorbell holding a clipboard and a healthy dose of professional doubt. My parents would open the door wearing dark, conservative clothing. They would invite him into their immaculate living room, offer him a cup of fresh coffee, and begin the performance of a lifetime. They would cry on cue. My father would offer stoic, trembling answers. My mother would clutch her chest. The stolen sapphire, glittering under the recessed lighting. They had spent decades perfecting the art of suburban victimhood. They knew exactly how to manipulate authority figures by wrapping their greed in the impenetrable shield of a grieving family. If Vance walked blindly into that environment, their emotional theater might overwhelm his objective logic. They would hand him the forged documents, shed their perfect tears, and secure his signature to release the $1 million. I could not allow them to dictate the narrative. I could not let them control the timeline. I reopened the laptop and searched for nearby commercial lodging. Corporate investigators do not fly into a city the morning of a major field interview. They arrive the night before. I cross-referenced corporate travel accounts with hotels located within a 5-mile radius of my parents' neighborhood. I found a business-class hotel suite, booked under the name of the insurance conglomerate. Agent Vance was currently sleeping 3 miles away from my motel. I set the alarm on my burner phone for 6 in the morning. I was not going to wait for the investigator to sit on their couch and be manipulated by their fabricated tragedy. I was going to intercept him. Long before he reached their front door, I was going to hand him the unvarnished truth. And then, I was going to turn his routine fraud interview into a supervised federal sting operation. My alarm was set for 6:00 in the morning, but my eyes opened at 3:00. The motel room was pitch black, save for the red digits of the digital clock and the amber standby light on my refurbished laptop. The heating unit rattled in the corner, blowing dry air across the cheap carpet. I sat up, pulling the scratchy blanket over my shoulders. Sleep was a luxury I could not afford. The revelation of the $1 million insurance policy and the stolen sapphire pendant had crystallized my objective, but a glaring logistical void remained in the center of my investigation. You cannot simply ask a foreign government for a death certificate. You need a body. You need a coroner to sign a declaration. You need an official chain of custody to repatriate remains or arrange a local burial. My parents had orchestrated this entire scheme from a pristine living room in Michigan. They did not fly to Portugal to identify a corpse. They did not navigate the complex Iberian legal system. They hired someone, and whatever physical evidence that person provided to the American consulate had to be convincing enough to satisfy both the State Department and the regional bank underwriters. I opened the laptop and initiated a deep dive into my father's digital footprint. Richard Thompson was a man who believed in keeping meticulous records of his own brilliance. He possessed an arrogance that often translated into digital carelessness. I bypassed his primary email accounts and targeted the hidden archives. Years ago, I had configured a secure network storage drive for his home office. I knew the backdoor access protocols. I bypassed the dual authentication and entered the root directory. I sifted through folders containing golf club memberships, tax returns, and Bradley's endless legal defense invoices. Deep within the architecture, nested inside a directory labeled Home Maintenance, I located a single encrypted compressed file. The encryption was robust, utilizing a standard military-grade algorithm. But people are creatures of habit. My father used the same foundational password structure for everything. A combination of his wedding anniversary and Bradley's birth year. He never included my birth year. I ran a targeted brute force script, utilizing those specific numeric variations. 20 minutes later the progress bar turned green. The file decrypted. A cache of emails flooded my screen. The correspondence occurred between my father and an anonymous encrypted Proton mail address. The user simply signed his messages with the initial M. I started reading the exchange from the beginning, dating back to the exact week. My corporate debit card declined in Lisbon. The first email from my father was brief. He requested discreet assistance handling a localized tragedy involving his daughter. He claimed he needed to expedite the paperwork to spare his wife the emotional agony of a prolonged international repatriation. M replied hours later. The fixer laid out a menu of illicit services. He offered forged medical records, bribed hospital administrators, and manufactured police reports. But the final requirement for the consulate was a physical reality. The United States government required biological proof to issue a consular report of death abroad. I scrolled down to the next message. The words on the screen made the blood freeze in my veins. My father haggled over the price of human remains and proposed a solution. The morgues in Lisbon occasionally held unclaimed individuals, transients or undocumented workers, with no identified next of kin. M offered to bribe a local mortuary technician to reassign a Jane Doe to my name. The fixer would then arrange for a swift, undocumented cremation. Cremation destroys fingerprints. Cremation destroys dental records. Cremation turns a complex, biological identification process into a simple jar of grey powder and a forged piece of paper. My father authorized the transaction. He wired $50,000 in cryptocurrency to M. The final email in the chain contained a tracking number for a sealed diplomatic parcel, shipped directly to the United States consulate, and eventually forwarded to my parents' address in Michigan. A wave of profound physical nausea washed over me. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stared at the peeling wallpaper. They did not merely bribe a corrupt doctor to falsify a signature. They purchased the incinerated remains of a forgotten woman. They placed her ashes in a box, swore under penalty of perjury that the dust belonged to their own daughter, and used her tragic anonymity to steal a trust fund. The scope of their crime had just expanded beyond financial theft. This was no longer a white-collar fraud case involving forged signatures and stolen inheritance. This was the desecration of a human corpse. It was the trafficking of biological remains across international borders. It was a macabre federal nightmare carrying severe, mandatory prison sentences. My hands gripped the edge of the cheap motel desk. The stakes had skyrocketed, but so had the risk of exposure. My initial plan was to hand the trust documents and the insurance fraud evidence directly to the authorities. But the discovery of the ashes shifted the legal battlefield. If I walked into a police station right now and revealed my existence, my parents would instantly recognize the danger. They would execute their backup plan. Diane and Richard Thompson were master manipulators. If cornered by law enforcement, they would unleash a flawless performance of shock and horror. They would claim M was an opportunistic scam artist who preyed on their parental fears. They would tell the FBI that this mysterious fixer contacted them, informed them their daughter perished in a tragic accident, and demanded $50,000 to navigate the foreign bureaucracy and return her ashes. They would weep in the interrogation room, clutching each other, claiming they were the innocent victims of a cruel international extortion plot. They would say they spent the trust money because they honestly believed I was gone without a recorded confession. A skilled defense attorney would cast enough reasonable doubt to spare them a federal conviction. They would paint me as the unstable daughter who vanished, while they were merely trying to bring their child home. I could not let them control that narrative. I needed them to own the ashes. I needed them to arrogantly, confidently claim ownership of that urn in front of a federal authority. I needed them to double down on the cremation story without the safety net of plausible deniability. I looked at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was 5:00 in the morning. In 4 hours, Agent Vance would knock on their front door to conduct his insurance fraud investigation. He was a seasoned corporate auditor, tasked with verifying their $1 million claim. He was the exact federal authority I needed. If Vance interviewed them in their living room, he would ask detailed questions about my final days. He would demand to know the specifics of the repatriation. My parents would undoubtedly use the ashes to anchor their story. They would likely place the urn right on the coffee table to force his sympathy. They would weave a web of perjury so thick they could never escape it. But for the trap to be flawless, Vance needed to know the truth. Before he walked into their house, he needed to understand that he was walking into a crime scene, not a house of mourning. He needed to hear the lies and document them officially. I closed the encrypted file and wiped my search history. I grabbed my wool coat and the manila envelope containing the authentic trust documents. I checked the address of the business class hotel where Vance was currently sleeping. It was time to introduce the senior fraud investigator to the ghost he was assigned to investigate. I walked out of the motel room and started the engine of the rental car, preparing to intercept the one man who could turn their pristine suburban living room into a federal cage. The neon sign of the roadside diner cast a flickering red glow across the frost-covered windshield of my rental car. It was 6:45 in the morning. The Michigan sky remained a bruised heavy gray. I sat in the driver's seat, watching the entrance of the restaurant, the heater blowing warm air against my frozen hands. The diner sat exactly 2 miles from my childhood home, and less than a mile from the business hotel, where the insurance conglomerate housed their traveling executives. I stepped out of the vehicle, pulling my wool coat tight against the biting wind. The interior of the diner smelled of old coffee and fried bacon. The morning crowd consisted of tired truck drivers and local construction workers, hunched over ceramic mugs. I bypassed the front counter and slid into a corner booth in the back, selecting a seat facing the glass entrance doors. I did not have to wait long. At precisely 7 o'clock, a man walked through the double doors. He did not blend in with the local patrons. He wore a tailored charcoal suit beneath a slate trench coat, carrying a thick leather folio. His posture remained rigid, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the room with the casual, hyper-vigilance of a former federal agent. He was a man accustomed to entering hostile environments and evaluating risk. Agent Vance. He walked past the counter and chose a booth 3 tables away from my position. He removed his coat, folded it neatly beside him, and placed the leather folio onto the formica surface. A waitress dropped off a pot of black coffee. Without asking for his order, he unclasped a silver pen from his breast pocket and opened the folio. I waited until he took his first sip of coffee. I picked up the manila envelope resting beside me, stood up and walked over to his table. I slid into the vinyl seat directly across from him. He looked up, his brow furrowed in mild annoyance, likely assuming I was a confused patron or someone looking for spare change. He opened his mouth to speak. I did not give him the opportunity. I reached into my coat pocket and placed my Irish passport face up on the table. Next to it I set the printed copy of the forged $1 million life insurance policy declaration. Agent Vance, I said, keeping my voice low, blending my words with the clatter of silverware and the hum of the kitchen exhaust fan. I am Sarah Thompson. I am the woman you are scheduled to investigate for a 7-figure fatality payout. In exactly 2 hours. His silver pen stopped moving. The annoyance vanished from his features, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating stillness. He looked at the photograph and the passport. He raised his eyes and studied my face. He analyzed my bone structure, the shape of my jaw, the specific shade of my eyes. He was a professional skeptic, trained by the federal government to spot imposters and dissect complex frauds. He scrutinized the holographic seal on the European passport. He found no discrepancies. He set his pen down slowly. The State Department issued a certified death certificate for Sarah Thompson 30 days ago. He stated, his tone betraying no emotion. My parents purchased that certificate, I replied. I opened the manila envelope. I laid out the timeline, dealing the documents across the table like playing cards. I showed him the trust disbursement records from the regional bank. I pointed to the forged signature on the insurance application. I handed him the printed federal court docket detailing the wire fraud indictment currently hanging over my brother. I provided the motive for their sudden, desperate need for liquid capital. Vance studied the federal docket. He nodded once he understood financial desperation. He had likely watched countless families tear each other apart for far less than $1 million. Then I leaned forward and lowered my voice. I told him about the encrypted emails hidden on my father's hard drive. I detailed the $50,000 cryptocurrency transaction with the international fixer. I explained the origin of the ashes currently sitting in my parents' living room. Vance did not gasp. He did not ask theatrical questions. His jaw simply tightened, a subtle flex of muscle beneath his skin. He recognized the gravity of the shift. This was no longer a routine corporate inquiry regarding a questionable signature on a life insurance form. He was sitting across from a living victim in a cross-border human trafficking and wire fraud conspiracy. The desecration of human remains elevated the crime to a severe federal felony. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, bridging the distance between us. If I walk into their house at 9 o'clock and announce that you are alive, Vance said quietly, they will deny everything. They will claim they were victims of a sophisticated extortion plot. They will tell local law enforcement that a foreign scam artist convinced them you were dead, and they only filed the insurance claim to cover the tragic costs of recovering your remains. They will hire a luxury defense firm and tie my company up in civil litigation for a decade. I know, I said. They are master manipulators. They are relying on the illusion of profound grief to secure your signature. Today, if you confront them directly, they will retreat behind their lawyers and play the victims. I slid a small silver thumb drive across the Formica table. That drive contains the digital footprint of their entire operation. I explained it holds the encrypted emails, the bank routing numbers, and the GPS data proving I was nowhere near the Portuguese hospital they cited. But digital evidence can be contested in court. We need them to confess without realizing they are confessing. That is why you are going to keep your 9 o'clock appointment. Vance looked at the silver drive. You want me to conduct the interview. I want you to sit on their expensive sofa, I instructed. Drink their coffee. Let them hand you the forged death certificate. Ask them specifically about the repatriation process. Ask them how they brought my ashes home. Let them weave their story. Let them commit wire fraud, insurance fraud, and perjury on an official corporate recording. Let them dig the hole. I will provide the shovel. Vance stared at me. I could see the risk assessment processing behind his eyes. If he halted the claim now, he saved his conglomerate $1 million, but risked a public relations nightmare involving a grieving family. If he gathered undeniable evidence of a federal crime, he handed the authorities a wrapped indictment and permanently immunized his employer against any future civil retaliation. He picked up the thumb drive and slipped it into his trench coat pocket. He gathered the copy of the forged insurance policy. I record all field interviews for quality assurance, Vance said, his tone shifting into a sharp operational cadence. I will ask them to verify the chain of custody for the remains. I will ask them to swear on tape that the biological material belongs to you. The sting operation was officially sanctioned, but handing the interview over to Vance meant surrendering control of the room. I could not sit in the diner and hope he asked the right questions. I needed to hear every word my parents said. I needed to monitor the trap in real time to ensure the perimeter held. I looked at Vance. I need to hear the interview as it happens. If they pivot, or if my brother arrives and changes the narrative, I need to know instantly. Vance considered the request. He understood the tactical advantage of having the victim monitor the lies. He reached into his coat and unclipped a secondary corporate mobile device. I will initiate a secure conference line and mute my end of the transmission before I ring their doorbell, he said. You can listen to the live audio feed from your vehicle, but you do not intervene. You do not approach the property. If they spot you looking through a window, the operation collapses. I memorized the dial-in number he provided and nodded. I will be parked down the street. Vance stood up, dropping a $5 bill on the table for his untouched coffee. He picked up his leather folio. We had a plan. The corporate auditor was walking into a suburban home, armed with the truth. I finished my coffee, walked out into the freezing Michigan morning, and started the engine of my rental car. The drive to my childhood neighborhood took less than 10 minutes. I parked 3 houses down from my parents' driveway, dialing into the secure conference line. As the digital tone chimed, connecting my phone to the device in Vance's pocket, I stared at the familiar front door of my old house. The trap was set. Now I just had to listen to them spring it. I parked the rented sedan 3 houses down from my childhood home, cutting the engine to silence the heater. The Michigan morning remained brutally cold, but cracking a window slightly was necessary to prevent the glass from fogging and obscuring my view. I slipped a discreet, wireless earpiece into my right ear, syncing it to the secondary mobile device Agent Vance carried in his trench coat. I also activated a secondary receiver, linked to a tiny audio bug I had pressed into the underside of their living room sofa during a previous covert visit. The dual feeds provided complete acoustic dominance over the environment. I sat in the freezing car, staring at the familiar brick facade, waiting for the performance to begin. A sleek, black town car pulled into their pristine driveway. At 8:55, Agent Vance stepped out, his posture rigid, his leather folio tucked securely under his arm. He walked up the paved walkway and pressed the doorbell. The heavy wooden door opened. Through the earpiece, I heard the subtle friction of hinges, followed immediately by my mother's voice. It was a masterpiece of auditory manipulation. Her tone was weak, breathy and saturated with practiced trembling sorrow. "Mr. Vance," she murmured, the sound of her voice filtering clearly through the hidden microphone. "Thank you for coming. Please come inside. It is just so difficult to discuss this over the phone." I listened to the hollow thud of the front door closing. The acoustics shifted from the crisp outdoor wind to the muffled acoustics of their carpeted foyer. Vance offered his formal condolences, his voice a flat professional baritone. My father greeted him, his tone somber and heavy. The microphone under the sofa picked up the distinct sound of someone sitting down on the leather cushions, followed by the clinking of ceramic cups. My mother was offering him coffee. She was establishing the hospitable, grieving environment designed to disarm him. For the next 45 minutes I sat in the freezing sedan and listened to the people who raised me dismantle my life. With breathtaking ease, Vance initiated the formal interview by requesting the original documentation. My father presented the fabricated Portuguese medical records and the forged death certificate, citing dates and locations with unwavering confidence. When Vance inquired about the circumstances surrounding the fatal hiking accident, my father launched into a tragic narrative. He described a sudden rock slide, a heroic rescue attempt by local authorities, and my supposed final moments in a foreign hospital. He spun the tale with such conviction, introducing minor realistic details that an unprepared investigator would have undoubtedly believed him. My mother provided the emotional counterweight to his factual delivery. She cried perfectly on cue. She described a sudden, chilling premonition she experienced the night the accident allegedly occurred, claiming she felt my spirit leave the earth. She spoke about my supposed lifelong struggles with depression, painting me as a fragile soul who wandered overseas, searching for peace she could never find. Sitting in the car, my knuckles turned white against the steering wheel. They were not merely stealing my inheritance, they were actively assassinating my character to justify their theft. By framing me as a troubled, lost individual, they minimize the tragedy of my death and maximize their own role as the long-suffering, devoted parents. Then Vance executed the crucial pivot we discussed in the diner. He steered the conversation toward the repatriation process. "I understand the complexities of international fatalities," Vance said smoothly, the rustle of paperwork echoing through the earpiece. "Our underwriters require a strict chain of custody regarding the remains. Did you arrange for a local burial, or were you able to secure a consular transfer for the body?" The living room fell silent for 3 agonizing seconds. I held my breath, waiting to see if they would retreat or double down. "We brought her home," my father stated, his voice steady. "The logistics of transporting a casket were too severe, given her injuries. The consulate recommended immediate cremation. We arranged the process through a liaison and shipped the ashes back to Michigan." Vance pressed further. "Do you possess the urn?" The corporation may require photographic documentation of the vessel to finalize the file. Before my father could answer, a new voice entered the audio feed. It was Bradley. He had clearly been sitting quietly in the room, waiting for his cue. "We scattered them," Bradley said, his tone thick with manufactured solemnity. It was what Sarah wanted. She loved the lake house up north. "We took the urn up there this past weekend. Just the family. It was a private closed ceremony. She is finally at peace." It was flawless perjury. Bradley, the golden child, facing a federal wire fraud indictment, had just sworn on an official corporate recording that he personally scattered the purchased remains of a foreign Jane Doe into a Michigan lake. They had eradicated the only physical evidence of their crime, constructing an airtight alibi built entirely on lies. They believed they had eliminated the final hurdle between themselves and $1 million. Mans did not challenge the assertion. He thanked them for their candor and indicated the interview was concluding. He was preparing to leave the trap intact. But as the sound of rustling papers signaled the end of the meeting, my mother delivered the ultimate insult. "Mr. Vance," she sobbed, the sound of a tissue tearing filtering through the microphone. "We are holding a massive memorial service for Sarah this Saturday. We rented the community church downtown. Almost 500 people are expected to attend. It would mean the world to us if you came. We just want to honor her memory. And perhaps seeing how loved she was will help finalize the claim." I stared at the brick house, my mind racing. She was not inviting him out of hospitality. She was inviting a corporate auditor to a theatrical production. She wanted him to witness a crowded church, a mountain of floral arrangements, and hundreds of weeping community members. She believed a public spectacle would provide the ultimate validation for the insurance claim. Pressuring his superiors into releasing the funds. Immediately Vance paused. "I would be honored to attend Mrs. Thompson Saturday morning. I will see you there." He politely accepted the invitation. The front door opened and closed. I watched Vance walk back down the driveway, climb into his town car and drive away. The audio feed cut out as he left the perimeter. I remained parked on the suburban street. The silence of the car amplifying the reality of their choices. My parents had passed the point of no return. They had submitted forged documents. They had lied about the ashes on tape. They had actively recruited an insurance investigator to witness a fraudulent funeral designed to cement a $1 million payday. They wanted a massive public spectacle. They wanted an audience to validate their grief and secure their stolen wealth. I looked down at the manila envelope resting on the passenger seat, containing the undeniable proof of my existence and their guilt. They wanted a show. I decided it was exactly what they were going to get. I started the engine, pulling away from my childhood home for the final time. As a silent victim, the preparation phase was over. It was time to infiltrate my own funeral. Saturday morning broke across Michigan with a brittle, biting chill. Frost clung to the edges of the leafless oak trees, lining the suburban streets. The sky hung low and gray, a perfect somber backdrop for a grand tragedy. My parents spared no expense. Utilizing my stolen funds, they rented Grace Cathedral, a towering stone structure, featuring soaring stained glass windows and arched buttresses that dominated the downtown skyline. Reserving this venue on short notice required a premium fee, a cost they gladly covered. Using the GoFundMe charity pool, the sheer irony tasted metallic in my mouth. They purchased the stage for my farewell, utilizing the misplaced sympathy of the very audience attending it. I parked my rental car in a concrete parking garage 3 blocks away. out of sight from the main thoroughfares. I walked the remaining distance, my collar pulled high. Approaching the cathedral from the street, I evaluated their defensive perimeter. 3 men wearing dark tailored suits stood near the heavy oak front doors, clear acoustic earpieces coiled down their necks. My mother claimed on social media that she hired private security to manage local news reporters and preserve the sanctity of the memorial. I understood the actual tactical reasoning. Those guards functioned as a physical barrier, designed to block unexpected creditors, angry former investors tied to Bradley, or anyone harboring hard questions, capable of ruining the lucrative optics. I could not walk through the main entrance. I required an alternative route. My attire provided the perfect urban camouflage. I wore a pressed black button-down shirt, dark straight leg slacks, and rubber-soled non-slip shoes. I secured my hair into a tight, severe bun at the nape of my neck, ensuring no loose strands framed my face. A pale blue surgical mask covered my mouth and nose. The caterer's uniform functioned as an invisibility cloak. In high-stress upscale environments, wealthy guests and anxious hosts do not look at service workers. They look right past them. I navigated toward the rear loading dock of the cathedral. The catering company, a premier local vendor my parents favored for country club events, operated out of 3 large white vans parked near the service doors. The tailgate of the nearest van sat open, revealing stacks of provisions. I stepped up to the bumper and grabbed a wooden crate. Resting near the edge, inside the crate, sat 12 chilled bottles of vintage champagne. It was the exact label my family intended to pop while toasting my demise at the afternoon reception. The physical weight of the glass bottles grounded my focus. I balanced the crate against my hip and stepped through the double doors into the bustling staging area. The church basement hit my senses with a wave of chaotic energy. The air smelled of roasted rosemary, warm yeast and melting butter. Prep cooks shouted sharp orders over the clatter of silver serving trays and the hiss of industrial coffee urns. I kept my chin tucked, moving with purposeful measured strides. If you act like you belong in a frantic environment, bearing a heavy load, no one questions your trajectory. A harried vet coordinator carrying a clipboard rushed past me, yelling for someone to transport the reception beverages upstairs to the fellowship hall. I nodded, bypassing her line of sight, and carried the heavy crate down a narrow, dimly lit corridor away from the kitchen. Grace Cathedral held secrets. In its historic architecture, I knew those secrets intimately. Decades ago I attended confirmation classes within these stone walls, while my parents mingled in the lobby. After Sunday services, I spent my mornings exploring the forgotten, silent corners of the building. I knew exactly where the blind spots were. At the far end of the hall, concealed behind a heavy dust-covered velvet curtain, sat a spiraling wooden staircase. The passage was originally designed for maintenance, access and bell ringers. I slipped behind the curtain. The steps groaned softly under my boots. As I began the ascent, the air grew stale and warm the higher I climbed. Dust motes danced in the thin beams of light, filtering through the narrow exterior stone slits. I reached the top landing and pushed open a small, arched wooden door. It swung outward on well-oiled hinges. I stepped into the choir loft. The balcony sat elevated high above the rear of the main sanctuary, shrouded in deep shadows. The space remained empty, as the church no longer utilized a live choir. For modern memorial services, I set the wooden crate down on the floorboards, taking extreme care not to let the glass bottles clink. I stepped forward, keeping my body angled behind the thick pillars. and peered over the carved mahogany railing. The scale of the production below stole my breath. Hundreds of white lilies and orchids cascaded down the marble altar steps, filling the cavernous room with a suffocating, sweet floral perfume. A massive projector screen hung near the pulpit, displaying a rotating slideshow of my childhood. Photograph stacks of glossy full-color programs rested on polished oak tables near the entrance doors. I could see my own face staring back from the cover. An old corporate headshot, framed by gold-embossed lettering. The wooden pews filled rapidly. 400 people filed into the sanctuary, the low murmur of their voices echoing off the vaulted ceilings. I recognized high school teachers, former accounting co-workers, neighbors from my childhood street, and distant extended relatives. They wiped their eyes with tissues, whispering in hushed reverent tones, holding the glossy programs against their chests. They genuinely believed a tragic, foreign accident claimed my life. My parents had transformed a sacred space into a theater of deception, starring the very community that trusted them. Looking down at the authentic grief etched on the faces of my neighbors, the abstract nature of the financial fraud solidified into profound visceral disgust. Agent Vance arrived through the side entrance. He took a seat in the back row carrying no briefcase. Today he projected a quiet, respectful demeanor, playing his role as the sympathetic corporate auditor, assessing the human toll of the loss. Marcus, my attorney, stood near the opposite exit, blending in with the mourners, while subtly scanning the room. We had coordinated the timing down to the minute. Local law enforcement waited on standby, in unmarked vehicles, outside the perimeter, ready to move the moment Vance signaled the breach. The stage was set. The trap held firm. The ghost was in the rafters. The deep resonant chords of the pipe organs swelled, sending heavy vibrations through the floorboards of the loft. The murmur of the crowd died down instantly. The heavy oak doors at the back of the sanctuary swung open to reveal the grieving family. My father walked first, his arm wrapped firmly around my mother, supporting her fragile, trembling frame. Bradley trailed close behind, his head bowed, playing the role of the shattered older brother. I watched them march slowly down the center aisle, absorbing the sympathetic gazes of the audience. As they approached the front row, a shaft of morning light pierced the stained glass window, washing over my mother's figure. The illumination caught a distinct flash of brilliant blue, resting against her collarbone. She wore the custom sapphire pendant, my grandmother's necklace stolen from my apartment, repurposed as an accessory for the woman orchestrating my erasure. The sight of that gemstone resting against her skin ignited a sharp cold fury inside my chest. The infiltration was complete, but as my mother stepped up to the pulpit to deliver the eulogy, the psychological warfare was only just beginning. From the elevated vantage point of the choir loft, the dramatic irony hung thick and heavy in the air. Looking down over the carved mahogany railing, the sanctuary resembled a carefully directed stage play. The heavy wooden doors at the rear of the nave swung shut, sealing 400 mourners inside. The pipe organ transitioned from a low mournful prelude to a towering resonant hymn. The vibrations traveled up the stone pillars and hummed against the soles of my boots. I remained crouched in the shadows, hidden behind a thick velvet curtain, watching the architects of my demise walk down the center aisle. My father led the procession. He wore a crisp navy suit, his posture rigid, projecting the image of a stoic patriarch enduring unimaginable hardship. He held his chin high, nodding solemnly to the community leaders and local bank managers seated near the aisle. He was laying the groundwork for future sympathy, ensuring his reputation remained pristine. When the time came to solicit favors, or secure favorable loans. My mother gripped his arm, leaning her weight against his side. She walked with a calculated fragility, her steps slow and hesitant. She wore a tailored, black crepe dress that fell elegantly below her knees, a garment that looked brand new and undeniably expensive. She dabbed the corners of her eyes with a lace handkerchief, never smudging her flawless makeup. Bradley trailed a few paces behind them. He played the shattered sibling to perfection. He paused twice during the short walk to the altar, grasping the hands of sympathetic neighbors, lowering his head, whispering quiet words of gratitude. I scrutinized the fabric of his dark charcoal suit. The cut was impeccable, the break over his polished leather shoes exact. It was a bespoke garment, the kind of tailoring that required multiple fittings and a 5-figure price tag. He had purchased that suit using the initial offshore routing advance my parents authorized. He was attending my memorial service, draped in my stolen inheritance, networking with the very people he and my parents were currently defrauding. The procession reached the front row, a designated seating area, cordoned off by thick burgundy ropes. As my father guided my mother toward her seat, she turned slightly to face the congregation. A shaft of pale morning light pierced the stained glass window above the altar, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The light washed across her chest, a brilliant crystalline spark of deep indigo, flared against the dark fabric of her dress. My breath caught in my throat. My grip tightened on the wooden railing until my knuckles ached. Resting perfectly against her collarbone was the custom sapphire pendant. It was not a replica. It was the authentic vintage platinum setting, surrounding a flawless unheated salon sapphire, the heirloom my grandmother commissioned decades ago. My grandmother understood the toxic dynamics of our family better than anyone. Before her health declined, she called me into her study. She unlocked her personal jewelry box and placed the velvet case directly into my hands. She told me the sapphire belonged to a woman who possessed the quiet strength to forge her own path. She explicitly stated she was bypassing my mother, knowing Diane viewed heirlooms merely as liquid assets and trophies of status. My mother despised that decision. She harbored a decades-long resentment over the necklace, and now she possessed it. She had not simply walked into my vacant apartment to facilitate the transfer of the lease to Bradley. She had rummaged through my personal sanctuary before the ink on my forged death certificate was even dry. She had looted my hidden valuables, plundering the few tangible connections I retained. To the only family member who truly understood me, wearing the sapphire to the funeral was not a tribute. It was a victory lap. It was a psychological trophy, declaring her ultimate triumph over my grandmother's final wishes. She was broadcasting her dominance, confident that the only two people who knew the truth were dead. One rested in the ground, and the other supposedly resided in a decorative urn sitting on the altar. I tore my gaze away from the shimmering blue gemstone and surveyed the wider room. The scale of the deception was breathtaking. Row after row of honest, hard-working people bowed their heads in silent reverence. I spotted my high school chemistry teacher dabbing his eyes. I saw the elderly couple from my childhood street clutching a printed program. These people had donated $42,000 to the repatriation fund, believing they were alleviating a profound financial burden. They were unwitting extras in $1 million production. I shifted my focus to the perimeter. Agent Vance sat in the last pew near the vestibule. He wore a neutral expression, his hands folded in his lap. He did not carry a clipboard or a briefcase today. He blended seamlessly into the crowd, a silent observer, recording mental notes of the spectacle. He watched my parents take their seats, fully aware that the grief on display was a calculated preamble to a felony insurance payout. Near the eastern exit, standing half in the shadow of a stone archway, Marcus maintained his position. My attorney wore a dark trench coat, his eyes scanning the crowd. He caught the subtle movement of my shadow in the loft above. He did not wave or nod, but his posture shifted, signaling his readiness. Outside the thick oak doors, local law enforcement waited in unmarked vehicles, holding warrants drafted the previous night. The snare was primed. The pastor, an older man with a gentle demeanor, stepped up to the wooden podium. He adjusted the microphone. A sharp screech of feedback, echoing briefly through the sanctuary. The service was officially commencing. I stepped back from the railing and retreated into the darkest corner of the choir loft. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, locating the intricate audio mixing board mounted on a built-in wooden desk. The church upgraded their sound system recently, utilizing a digital interface that routed the main altar microphone through a series of amplifiers housed in the balcony. I am a cybersecurity auditor. I dismantle complex, encrypted corporate networks for a living. Bypassing a local church audio feed required zero digital sophistication. It merely required the correct cables. I unzipped my small tactical bag and withdrew a thick auxiliary cord and a specialized adapter. I traced the wiring harness running out of the main mixing board, locating the primary output channel that fed the towering speakers mounted throughout the nave. I unplugged the local monitor feed and inserted my adapter, creating a direct hardline connection. Overriding the manual sliders, I pulled the prepaid burner phone from my pocket. I plugged the auxiliary cable into the headphone jack. I opened the microphone application, adjusting the gain and testing the internal decibel levels. The screen glowed with a harsh white light. In the dark loft, down below, the pastor welcomed to the congregation, his deep voice filling the room, praising the resilience of the Thompson family. He spoke about the tragic fragility of life and the enduring strength of a mother's love. Every word he uttered thickened the web of lies my parents had spun. He offered a final prayer of comfort and stepped back from the podium. Gesturing toward the front row, he invited my mother to step forward and share a few words about her beloved daughter. The moment was approaching. I stood in the shadows, holding the phone close to my mouth, watching my mother stand up from the pew. The sapphire gleamed under the spotlights as she walked toward the microphone. I rested my thumb over the digital transmit button on my screen, waiting for her to deliver the eulogy that would become her final, fatal mistake. The heavy silence inside Grace Cathedral felt expectant, almost sacred. As my mother approached the carved wooden pulpit, the pastor offered her a sympathetic nod and stepped down, allowing her full command of the stage. She gripped the edges of the podium with both hands. Her posture conveyed a delicate balance of overwhelming grief and brave maternal resolve. The overhead spotlights illuminated the deep blue facets of the stolen sapphire pendant, resting against her collarbone. She took a slow, shuddering breath, ensuring the microphone captured the sound of her fabricated anguish. The acoustics of the cavernous room amplified her exhalation, carrying it to the furthest pews. Sarah was a deeply complex, troubled soul. My mother began. Her voice resonated through the massive speakers, soft and laced with practiced heartbreak. She wandered far from home, constantly moving from city to city, searching for a peace she could never quite find. We worried about her constantly. She pushed us away when we tried to draw her close, But a mother never stops loving her child, no matter the distance. I stood perfectly still in the shadowed choir loft, the burner phone gripped tightly in my hand. The audacity of the historical rewrite hit me with physical force. She was not merely eulogizing a fiction. She was actively character assassinating me, in front of my entire community. By painting me as a fragile, unstable wanderer, she accomplished two crucial objectives. First, she made my sudden death in a foreign country seem plausible, almost inevitable. Second, she deflected any potential questions regarding my prolonged absence or our strained relationship. She transformed her years of neglect into a narrative of unrequited parental devotion. We gave her everything. My mother continued, her voice hitching flawlessly on the word everything. She raised a trembling hand and dabbed at a completely dry eye with her lace handkerchief. We provided every opportunity, every advantage. But the world is a dangerous place. For those who refuse a safe harbor. I looked down at the congregation. 400 heads nodded in somber unison. The elderly couple from my childhood street clutched each other's hands. My former chemistry teacher stared at the floor, looking genuinely heartbroken. They were consuming her toxic fiction without a single trace of skepticism. She was manipulating their empathy with surgical precision, validating their donations to the GoFundMe campaign by confirming the tragic narrative they had already funded. My gaze shifted to the front row. My father sat with his head bowed, projecting stoic endurance. Bradley stepped up from the pew and stood beside the pulpit, placing a comforting, heavy hand on my mother's shoulder. He looked out at the audience, his jaw set in a mask of noble sorrow, the golden child standing in a bespoke suit, purchased with my stolen inheritance, playing the protective anchor for the grieving family. The visual hypocrisy was suffocating. They were minutes away from walking out of the cathedral as newly minted millionaires. Agent Vance sat in the back row taking mental notes. If this performance concluded without interruption, Vance would likely authorize the release of the $1 million life insurance payout. By Monday morning, the regional bank would execute the offshore wire transfer of my grandmother's trust. The federal prosecutor would accept Bradley's restitution payment. They would be entirely absolved of their deaths, their crimes washed clean by the manufactured tears currently flowing at the altar. And then my mother delivered the final fatal stroke of her monologue. In the end, my mother said, her voice dropping to an intimate, fragile whisper, Sarah's tragic accident reminded us that family is the only thing that truly matters. She left us so suddenly, but her final gift to us will ensure her brother's future is secure. She knew Bradley was facing challenges, and she wanted to provide a foundation for his upcoming marriage. We will use her generous parting gift to honor her legacy and build a future she would be proud of. The sheer calculated evil of that statement echoed in the rafters. She was not just stealing my money, she was retroactively framing the theft of the trust fund and the life insurance policy as my dying wish. She was telling 400 people that I voluntarily surrendered my grandmother's legacy to fund Bradley's legal defense and luxury wedding. She was laundering the stolen capital in broad daylight, using my own memorial service to preemptively explain the sudden influx of wealth they were about to enjoy. She smiled through her performance, a tragic, brave expression. She looked down at the polished wooden urn resting on a small pedestal beside the pulpit. The urn contained the incinerated remains of an unknown Jane Doe purchased from an international fixer, trafficked across borders, and presented as the final resting place of their daughter. I pray she has finally found her peace. My mother whispered. Thank you all for loving her. She bowed her head, yielding the pulpit. A heavy reverent silence settled over the cathedral. The congregation held its collective breath, mourning the beautiful, generous fiction she had just woven. Radley wrapped his arm around her shoulders, turning to guide her back down the altar steps, to their seats. They thought they had won. They believed the transaction was complete. I stepped out from behind the velvet curtain, moving to the very edge of the carved mahogany railing, overlooking the sanctuary. The darkness of the loft concealed my figure, but I had a clear, unobstructed view of the altar directly below. I looked down at the burner phone in my hand. The auxiliary cable remains securely plugged into the headphone jack, bridging my device directly into the cathedral's main audio mixing board. I check the volume slider on the screen, pushing the digital gain to maximum capacity. The pastor approached the pulpit again, clearing his throat, preparing to offer a final benediction. Before dismissing the attendees to the reception hall, he reached for the microphone. I pressed my thumb down on the digital transmit button. I did not yell. I did not scream. I spoke in a clear, measured and absolute tone, my voice carrying the cold weight of a balanced ledger. That was a beautiful eulogy, Mom, I said. The sound blasted through the towering speakers, mounted along the stone pillars, shattering the silent reverence of the sanctuary. The acoustics of the cathedral caught the amplified words, bouncing them off the vaulted ceilings, creating a booming, omnipresent echo that commanded the attention of every single person in the room. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. The pastor flinched, physically jumping backward from the podium, assuming a technical malfunction. 400 heads snapped upwards simultaneously, scanning the vaulted ceiling, searching for the source of the disembodied voice. A collective gasp rippled through the wooden pews, a sound of pure, unadulterated shock. Down at the altar, my mother froze mid-step, her hand clamped onto Bradley's arm, with a vice-like grip. The color drained entirely from her face, leaving her skin a sickening ashen gray. She stared straight ahead, her eyes wide, processing the impossible reality of the voice she had just heard. Bradley stumbled backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the marble floor. He physically tripped over a massive arrangement of white lilies, sending petals and stagnant water cascading across the stone steps. My father vaulted out of his seat in the front row, his head swiveling wildly, his stoic facade crumbling into naked panic. I kept my thumb pressed firmly against the screen. I was not finished. The performance was over, and the audit was officially beginning. The echo of my voice faded into the vaulted ceiling, leaving behind a silence possessing a physical density. 400 mourners sat frozen, suspended in a collective state of disbelief. Down at the altar, my mother stood immobilized. Behind the carved wooden pulpit, the printed eulogy script she held slipped from her numb fingers. The pages fluttered downward, drifting like dead leaves, to rest against the polished marble steps. The manufactured sorrow melted from her features, instantly replaced by stark, unfiltered terror. Her jaw worked silently, struggling to form words. Her paralyzed vocal cords refused to produce. Bradley scrambled backward, his polished shoes finding no traction on the smooth stone. His sudden, erratic retreat sent him crashing into a towering iron stand holding dozens of white lilies. The metal display toppled over with a resounding crash, sending a wave of stagnant floral water and crushed petals washing across the pristine floor. The golden boy, the charismatic real estate mogul, facing federal indictment, sat drenched in the ruins of the floral decor. He stared upward toward the dark balcony with wide, unblinking eyes, his mouth hanging open in silent shock. I pressed my thumb against the transmit button on the burner phone, once more leaning closer to the receiver, to ensure my diction remains sharp and distinct. But my soul is not troubled, I stated, my voice projecting evenly through the high-fidelity speakers mounted along the nave. And my bank accounts certainly are not. I released the button and pulled the auxiliary cable from the headphone jack. The public address system let out a brief sharp hum before cutting to static. I dropped the phone into my slacks pocket. The time for hiding in the shadows of the choir loft was over. I turned away from the audio mixing board and pushed through the heavy velvet curtain, concealing the spiral wooden staircase. The descent felt entirely different from the climb. Ascending those steps hours ago, I operated as a ghost infiltrating a fortress. Moving downward now, I shed that spectral identity. I reached up and pulled the pale blue surgical mask from my face, tossing it onto the dusty steps. I pulled the restrictive pins from my hair, letting it fall loose around my shoulders. Every step I took resonated with a dull thud against the old timber, a rhythmic countdown, marking the end of their elaborate fiction. I reached the bottom landing and pushed the arched wooden door open. It swung wide on its heavy iron hinges, revealing the rear vestibule of the main sanctuary, the bright morning light filtering through the towering, stained glass windows hit my eyes, forcing me to blink against the sudden glare. I stepped out from the alcove and turned the corner, aligning myself with the center aisle. The congregation turned in their wooden pews as one synchronized entity. The collective intake of breath sounded like a sudden rush of wind, sweeping through a narrow canyon. People seated near the edge of the aisle physically recoiled. They pressed their backs against the wooden backing of the pews, pulling their knees inward, shrinking away from my path, as if witnessing an apparition. A woman in the third row dropped her leather handbag, the contents spilling loudly onto the floorboards. No one moved to retrieve the scattered items. I walked forward. My rubber-soled boots traded their muted thud for a sharp defined click against the marble central aisle. I kept my posture straight, my shoulders squared and my chin elevated. I passed the elderly couple from my childhood street. The husband had his arm wrapped tightly around his wife. His eyes darted from my face to the glossy funeral program trembling in his hand, struggling to reconcile the living, breathing woman walking past him, with the printed obituary resting on his lap. I walked past my former high school teachers. The fabricated grief on their faces morphed into profound confusion, and then slowly a creeping sense of betrayal. As the reality of the situation began to take root, they recognized the catering uniform. They realized they had paid for this theatrical performance. For 32 years, I navigated this community as a background character. I was the reliable daughter, the quiet sister, the utility they summoned when the network failed, or the checkbook unbalanced. My parents conditioned me to believe my value existed solely in my silent servitude. They trained me to avoid drawing attention, to yield the spotlight to my older brother, to accept the margins of my own existence. Walking down that marble aisle, surrounded by staring eyes and hushed whispers, I felt that lifetime of conditioning evaporate into the cold air. I was no longer the compliant scapegoat. I was no longer the invisible workhorse, expected to absorb the financial damage of their reckless choices. I was the consequence of their unrestrained greed, marching right into the center of their masterpiece. I closed the distance toward the altar. My father stepped in front of my mother, throwing out his arms in a wide, erratic gesture, attempting to physically shield her from my approach. His chest heaved with rapid panicked breaths. He looked toward the side exits, his eyes darting frantically, searching for the private security guards he hired to control the perimeter. The guards remained stationed outside the heavy oak doors, oblivious to the internal collapse of the memorial service. I stopped at the edge of the burgundy velvet ropes, separating the front row from the main congregation. I stood 5 feet away from the people who raised me. The proximity stripped away the grand theatricality of the cathedral, reducing the conflict to its raw, unvarnished core. My mother gripped the edge of the wooden pulpit for support. Her knuckles turned stark white under the pressure. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, jagged increments. Up close, the flawless foundation and mascara could not hide the fine tremor vibrating through her jawline. The custom sapphire pendant, the heirloom she stole from my apartment to celebrate her victory, caught the overhead light and shimmered against her collarbone. It looked heavy, a beautiful, undeniable anchor, dragging her downward into the reality of her crimes. Bradley scrambled to his feet, brushing the crushed white lilies in stagnant water from the fabric of his expensive, bespoke suit. Water dripped from his cuffs onto the marble. The charismatic charm he wielded like a weapon was entirely gone, replaced by the frantic, hunted expression of a man realizing his federal plea deal had just evaporated into thin air. He opened his mouth, stammering, trying to construct a lie, to explain the impossible reality standing in front of him. My father found his voice. First, he stepped toward the edge of the marble steps, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. He raised his voice, projecting a false, desperate authority, attempting to hijack the narrative. Before the audience could process the truth, he tried to rely on the old dynamic, the one where he commanded and I obeyed, the one where he controlled the reality of our family. Toxic families rarely surrender when cornered in public. They pivot. My father was preparing to launch a desperate, secondary deception to save the $1 million payday and protect his golden child. He assumed I arrived empty-handed, relying solely on my physical presence to disrupt the ceremony. He did not realize I brought the receipts, and I needed to cut off his escape route before he could utter a single lie. My father locked his eyes on mine, his jaw trembling as he searched for a tactical angle. He opened his mouth to spin the narrative, preparing to declare me a disturbed stranger, crashing a sacred event. A voice fractured his momentum before he could speak. Sarah, the whisper originated from the first pew. Aunt Karen, my father's younger sister, sat clutching a damp tissue in her lap. Her eyes mapped the contours of my face, recognizing the familial architecture no disguise could hide. Her voice held a fragile mixture of hope and terror, struggling to process the impossible geometry of the moment. I turned my head slightly, shifting my focus from the perpetrators to their collateral damage. "I am alive, Aunt Karen," I said, keeping my tone steady and clear, ensuring the first 2 rows caught every syllable. I turned back to the altar, locking my gaze onto my parents. The time for silent observation had expired. It was time to read the ledger aloud, line by damning line. "Unlike the hospital records you forged in Portugal," I stated, raising my voice to carry over the rising murmur of the congregation. "Unlike the repatriation charity fund you launched to siphon $42,000 from our neighbors." A sudden sharp intake of breath echoed behind me. The people sitting in the pews were processing the raw data. The donors, the teachers, the elderly neighbors who had typed their credit card numbers into a fake memorial page, realized their empathy had been weaponized. The grieving parents were morphing into financial predators before their eyes. The soft weeping in the sanctuary hardened into an uneasy, shifting tension. I took one step closer to the velvet ropes. And unlike the cremated remains you purchased from an international trafficker to defraud the United States government, I delivered the final devastating line. Whose ashes are sitting on that pedestal, Mom? The sanctuary erupted. The reverent silence shattered into a chaotic storm of bewildered whispers, angry murmurs and stifled cries. The community leaders, who had offered their solemn condolences moments ago, now stared at the altar with visceral disgust. The illusion of the mourning family dissolved into a grotesque reality. The pristine suburban facade fractured, exposing the dark, calculated machinery operating beneath it. My father realized. The audience was slipping from his control. The murmurs behind him were not sounds of sympathy. They were sounds of rising outrage. He abandoned his stoic patriarch persona and resorted to brute force gaslighting. He lunged forward, closing the distance between the altar steps and the velvet ropes. He extended a shaking hand, attempting to grab the fabric of my catering uniform, hoping physical intimidation would silence the truth. "Do not listen to her," my father shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He addressed the congregation, sweeping his arm toward me in a frantic arc. "She is an imposter. She is a disturbed woman trying to extort a grieving family. Our daughter is gone. Call the police. Someone remove this woman." He wanted law enforcement. He was about to receive his requested intervention. At the rear of the nave, the heavy oak doors swung inward. The brass hinges groaned. A deep resonant friction that sliced through the chaotic chatter of the crowd. Agent Vance stepped out from the back row, where he had observed the entire performance. He no longer projected the quiet demeanor of a sympathetic corporate auditor. His posture shifted into the rigid, authoritative stance of a seasoned federal operative. He reached into his slate trench coat and withdrew a leather credential wallet, flipping it open to display a silver badge. 3 armed agents, wearing tactical jackets bearing the bold yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, walked through the open doors flanking Vance. Their boots hit the marble with synchronized, heavy thuds. A relentless march that commanded immediate compliance. The congregation parted instantly. The attendees scrambled out of the center aisle, pressing themselves deep into the wooden pews to clear a path for the approaching federal asset. The anger in the room gave way to stunned obedience. Vance marched down the center aisle, his eyes fixed dead ahead on the altar. The polite facade of the morning corporate interview was over. He was acting on the audio surveillance evidence gathered during the sting operation, combined with the public perjury he just witnessed firsthand. The trap had closed, and he was here to collect the bounty. "Diane and Richard Thompson," Vance announced. His baritone voice projected an unyielding, metallic authority that silenced every remaining whisper in the room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, insurance fraud and perjury." My father froze. His outstretched hand dropped to his side, heavy and useless. The desperate, fabricated anger drained from his features, leaving only the hollow realization that his empire of lies had fractured beyond repair. He looked at the approaching agents, the silver badge catching the ambient light, and the last shred of his defiance evaporated into the cold church air. My mother let out a sharp, breathless whimper. Her knees buckled. She swayed, grabbing the edge of the wooden pulpit to prevent herself from collapsing onto the crushed lilies scattered across the marble. The custom sapphire pendant swung forward, a dazzling, expensive weight, pulling her downward into the reality of her crimes. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, silent plea for mercy I had no intention of granting. "Bradley," witnessed the federal agents closing the distance. The golden child. The architect of the initial financial crisis that sparked this macabre conspiracy. Calculated his odds. He realized the $1 million insurance payout was dead. He realized the offshore trust wire was never going to clear his escrow account. He realized the federal prosecutor, waiting for his restitution check, would revoke his plea deal by Monday morning, ensuring a lengthy prison sentence. Cowardice overrode his familial loyalty. He abandoned his parents at the altar. Without a second glance, Bradley spun on his heel and sprinted toward the eastern side exit. His ruined bespoke suit flapped around his knees. As he scrambled over the scattered floral arrangements, he aimed for the heavy, wooden side door leading out to the church courtyard, hoping to vanish into the city streets. Before the agents secured the perimeter, he never reached the brass handle. Marcus stepped out from the deep shadow of the stone archway, his dark trench coat blending seamlessly with the dim lighting. He did not flinch as Bradley charged toward him. Marcus simply shifted his weight, planting his feet firmly on the stone tiles, creating an immovable human barrier. Simultaneously, the eastern doors pulled open from the outside. 2 uniformed state troopers stepped into the threshold, their hands resting cautiously near their duty belts. They formed an impenetrable wall of law enforcement, securing the secondary exit. Bradley skidded to a halt. His leather shoes screeched against the polished stone. He looked at Marcus, the estate attorney he had spent years dismissing as an obsolete relic, and then looked at the state troopers, blocking his escape route. The perimeter was sealed from every conceivable angle. He raised his hands in a slow, defeated gesture of surrender, his chest heaving with exertion, the reality of his impending incarceration settling over him. Back at the main altar, the 3 federal agents ascended the marble steps. They bypassed the decorative wooden urn resting on its pedestal, ignoring the fabricated artifact that anchored the entire criminal enterprise. They flanked my parents, moving with practiced, efficient precision. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the lead agent instructed, his tone devoid of any sympathy. My father complied silently, his shoulders slumped in total defeat. He offered no resistance. His eyes cast downward at the ruined flowers. The metallic click of the steel handcuffs, locking around his wrists, echoed sharply in the quiet sanctuary, a sound representing the final period. At the end of a long, fraudulent sentence, my mother resisted for a fraction of a second, pulling her arm away, weeping genuine tears. For the first time in 30 days, an agent firmly grasped her wrists, guiding her hands behind her back, with undeniable force. As the steel cuffs secured her, the sapphire pendant caught the overhead spotlights. One final time. It gleamed against her dark dress, a silent testament to the vanity that fueled her spectacular downfall. I stood motionless behind the velvet ropes, my hands resting at my sides, watching the federal authorities dismantle my family. Piece by piece, 400 witnesses remained pinned to their seats, observing the chilling reality of the arrests. The fake funeral had officially transitioned into an active federal crime scene. The calculated patient extraction of justice was complete. Yet, as the agents guided my parents down the center aisle, toward the waiting squad cars, one final piece of business remained to be settled. The criminal charges addressed the fraud, but the fate of my grandmother's legacy required a different kind of resolution. The heavy oak doors of Grace Cathedral swung shut behind the departing federal agents, severing the chaotic scene outside. From the breathless quiet remaining in the sanctuary, the congregation remained pinned to the wooden pews. No one murmured. No one reached for their coats. The illusion had shattered so thoroughly that the residual shock held 400 people. In a collective paralyzed trance, I turned my back on the empty altar. The decorative wooden urn rested untouched. On its polished pedestal, a silent monument to the depths of their deception. I walked down the marble steps, retrieving the burner phone and the auxiliary cable from the choir loft. Mixing board as I reached the central aisle. Marcus approached from the eastern archway. He held out his hand, his palm open. Resting against his leather glove was the custom sapphire pendant he had intercepted. An agent before. My mother was placed into the transport vehicle, citing the gemstone as stolen property, integral to the underlying trust dispute. The authorities confiscated it as evidence, but Marcus utilized his legal credentials to secure an immediate chain of custody transfer. I picked up the necklace. The platinum setting felt cool and heavy against my skin. The deep blue facets caught the ambient light, filtering through the stained glass, untainted by the staggering betrayal it had just witnessed. I slipped the heirloom into my pocket, the tangible weight serving as the final, definitive period. At the end of their manufactured narrative, I walked out the side exit of the church, leaving the stunned community to process the ruins of the memorial service. The legal fallout descended upon my family with a swift mechanical precision they were entirely unprepared to navigate. Because the forgery involved international borders, foreign medical facilities, and the United States consulate, the jurisdiction fell exclusively to the federal government. There were no suspended sentences. There were no suburban country club lawyers capable of negotiating a polite, discreet probation. My parents faced a rigid federal judiciary system that viewed the desecration of human remains and the manipulation of community charity as an unforgivable breach of the social contract. They pled guilty to avoid a public trial. A trial would have broadcast every sordid detail of their communication with the international fixer, stripping away the last remaining shreds of their dignity. The judge handed down 5-year sentences in a federal correctional facility. Their immaculate reputation, the social currency they valued above all else, evaporated overnight. The neighbors who donated to the repatriation fund watched the evening news broadcasts in stunned silence. The casseroles in the prayer circles vanished, replaced by profound, enduring disgust. The local country club revoked their membership. Their names became a cautionary whisper within the very community they had tried to exploit. Radley faced a much steeper cliff. The federal prosecutor, handling his original real estate escrow fraud, did not look kindly upon his attempt to use a stolen inheritance to buy his freedom. His active involvement in the fake ashes scheme, combined with his perjury during the corporate insurance interview, compounded his legal peril. He stood before the same federal judge, stripped of his bespoke tailoring and his golden child armor. The court sentenced him to 8 years. The luxury Aspen wedding dissolved before the ink on his plea agreement dried. Jessica, the pragmatic social media influencer, realized the funding had evaporated, and the family name was a toxic liability. She deleted the aesthetic posts, cancelled the catering deposits, and vanished from his orbit without a backward glance. Bradley traded his planned penthouse lifestyle for a concrete cell, forced to confront the stark reality that his charismatic charm held zero currency within the federal prison system. The criminal convictions satisfied the Justice Department, but the ultimate poetic retribution originated directly from my grandmother. Marcus filed the necessary injunctions. The following Monday morning, he brought the authentic, notarized trust documents before a probate judge, and formally activated the strict morality clause. Because my parents committed documented, verifiable fraud against the estate. In an attempt to secure an unearned disbursement, they forfeited any current or future claims to the assets. The clause carried teeth far sharper than mere forfeiture. The specific legal language held them liable for all court costs and financial damages incurred during the recovery process. The financial burden was staggering. The court ordered them to refund every single penny of the $42,000 collected through the GoFundMe campaign. They lacked the liquid capital to satisfy the mounting debt. The bank foreclosed on their sprawling suburban home. The luxury vehicles were repossessed by the leasing agencies. The antique furniture, the crystal chandeliers, the curated artifacts of their manufactured status, were catalogued and auctioned off to satisfy the court mandates. They lost the very lifestyle they had sacrificed my legal existence to protect. The suburban fortress they built on a foundation of enabling and entitlement was dismantled and sold to the highest bidder. I recovered the $12 million trust in its entirety. The regional bank, terrified of a looming civil lawsuit regarding their failure to detect the forged signatures, released the capital with swift formal apologies. I claimed the civil damages awarded by the court, adding significant capital to the total. I possessed zero desire to remain in Michigan. The state held nothing but ghosts' cold winters and the lingering echoes of a family that only valued my utility. I sold the apartment complex lease, packed my few remaining personal items, and booked a first-class ticket back to Europe. I did not use the secondary Irish passport. I traveled under my own name, a living citizen, possessing pristine credit and a secure future. I settled in a quiet coastal town in the Mediterranean. The air smells of salt and blooming citrus, a stark contrast to the sterile, grey skies of the Midwest. I used the capital to launch my own independent cybersecurity firm. I built a boutique agency that secures digital infrastructure for international clients. I dictate my own hours. I choose my own contracts. I employ a small team of brilliant coders who value competence and straightforward communication. I wear the sapphire pendant every single day. It rests against my collarbone, a constant tangible reminder of the woman who provided the architecture for my freedom. My grandmother knew the specific gravity of the greed infecting her children. She knew I would eventually need a weapon to sever the ties, and she hid that weapon in plain sight, within the fine print of a legal contract. I spent my early adulthood believing my quiet utility defined my worth. I thought compliance equated to safety. I allowed a toxic family ecosystem to relegate me to the shadows, serving as the invisible engine, powering their grand illusions. But ghosts possess a unique tactical advantage. When you strip away a person's identity and steal their future, you remove the very constraints that kept them compliant. You force them to learn how to operate in the dark, to navigate without a safety net, to study the vulnerabilities in the system. I do not hide in the shadows anymore. I walk in the daylight, building a life defined by my own terms, funded by the very legacy they tried to erase. Sometimes the only way to deal with a family that treats you like a phantom is to accept the invitation. You let them build the coffin. You let them dig the grave. And then you come back and haunt them in broad daylight, standing at the altar armed with the receipts. The marble floor of Grace Cathedral is swept clean now. The crushed white lilies are gone, the stained glass windows dark, and the heavy oak doors locked against the Michigan winter. But the echoes of that Saturday morning remain, lingering like a ghost in the rafters. When we step back from the spectacular collapse of the Thompson family, beyond the federal indictments, the stolen trust funds, and the theatrical arrests, we find something far more common and far more terrifying. We find a quiet, ordinary failure of parenting. The story of Sarah Bradley in The Fake Funeral is not merely a tale of financial fraud. It is a forensic autopsy of a family that traded honesty for comfort and fairness for the illusion of success. Look closely at Bradley. In modern American culture, there is a dangerous temptation to shelter our children from the friction of reality. Parents often want to provide a seamless path, mistaking the absence of struggle for the presence of love. Diane and Richard looked at their son and saw a reflection of their own ambitions. They mistook his effortless charisma for character. When Bradley stumbled, they caught him. When he failed, they paid the bill. They believed they were protecting him, acting out of a distorted sense of traditional family responsibility, but shielding a child from the natural consequences of their actions does not build a safety net. It builds a cage. By treating Bradley as the golden child, exempt from the rules that governed the rest of the world, they stripped him of the opportunity to develop a moral compass. They taught him that his mistakes were just temporary obstacles for someone else to clear. When the federal wire fraud indictment arrived, Bradley lacked the internal architecture to face it with dignity. His parents did not save him by plotting a crime to pay his restitution. They merely financed his inevitable ruin, proving that endless enabling is never an act of devotion. It is a slow, quiet sabotage. On the other side of that distorted coin sits Sarah, the reliable daughter, the quiet problem solver. Traditional family structures rely on a foundational pillar of mutual support, but her parents corrupted that concept into a transactional ledger. They noticed Sarah possessed resilience, so they assigned her the role of the invisible workhorse. They assumed her silence equated to compliance. This is a subtle, pervasive danger in raising children. When one child requires less immediate supervision, parents often redirect their emotional bandwidth to the louder, more demanding sibling. The quiet child learns to shrink, to fix the wireless router, to co-sign the loan, and to accept the scraps of conditional affection left behind. But emotional awareness requires recognizing that a child's utility does not negate their need for genuine connection. A family is not a corporate entity. You cannot designate one child as the liability and the other as the asset. When parents treat love as a scarce resource, to be rationed based on performance or preference, they breed a resentment that eventually burns the entire house to the foundation. Sarah did not destroy her family. She merely held up a flawless mirror to the rot they had cultivated for 3 decades. The only adult who understood the assignment of true guidance was the grandmother. She represented the traditional values Diane and Richard abandoned. She observed the toxic dynamics, recognized the entitlement infecting her grandson, and saw the quiet strength buried within her granddaughter. She did not leave her wealth blindly. She embedded a strict morality clause within her trust, a legal mechanism designed to enforce the accountability her own children refused to practice. She understood that a parent's ultimate duty is not to hand a child a frictionless life, but to equip them with the integrity to navigate a difficult one. Her failsafe was a final enduring lesson in fairness, reaching from beyond the grave to correct a ledger left unbalanced for too long. The parents prioritized the aesthetic of a successful suburban family over the gritty, difficult work of actual parenting. They cared more about the country club membership, the manicured lawn, and the opinions of the neighbors. Sitting in those wooden pews, then they cared about the integrity of their own home. They orchestrated a breathtaking public deception. Because the alternative meant admitting they had raised a criminal. They chose to purchase the ashes of a stranger, rather than face the judgment of their peers. This obsession with image over honesty is a familiar cultural trap. We curate our lives for public consumption, polishing the surface, while the load-bearing walls crack under the pressure of unspoken truths. Raising children requires the courage to let them fail, the humility to admit our own shortcomings, and the strength to prioritize character over public perception. True family responsibility means holding the people you love accountable, even when doing so shatters the perfect picture you painted for the outside world. We all navigate the delicate architecture of family dynamics, balancing our obligations, our resentments, and our quiet hopes. Sometimes untangling the knots requires hearing a story that sounds alarmingly like a distorted version of our own. If you find value in dissecting these complex narratives, in exploring the psychological mechanics of betrayal and the power of boundary setting, I invite you to become a permanent part of our community. Subscribe to the Revenge Order channel. We uncover the quiet truths hidden beneath polite society, dissecting the moments where ordinary people draw a line in the sand and reclaim their autonomy. The judge dropped the gavel. The prison doors locked shut. The European cybersecurity firm thrived under the Mediterranean sun. The ledger finally balanced itself out. But when the dust settles on the broken lilies and the empty pews, a haunting question remains, hovering in the quiet corners of our own living rooms. When we look at the children we raise, the siblings we tolerate, and the parents we seek to please, what currency are we truly using to measure our devotion? Are we nurturing individuals capable of standing in the light? Or are we quietly grooming ghosts to carry the weight of our own unacknowledged failures? The answer is rarely loud. It usually waits silent and patient, hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows and introduce itself.